Let us start with the introduction. Children's visual problems vary from relatively minor to profound in nature. Before a teacher, parent, or career begins to think about the educational implications of a child's visual impairment, they must remind themselves of one important fact. Any labels accompanying a child, whether it be the medical term for the visual impairment or a clinical assessment of the child's vision, should be taken into account but not considered as prescriptive. Two children may well have the same medical condition and even the same visual acuity and yet require remarkable different support within a school. Why is that? Many factors contribute to a child's ability to see. Only one of those factors is the physical condition of the eye or the intact pathways between the eye and the brain, which enables sensory information to be interpreted. Any problem in these areas result in the visual impairment. Factors affecting functional vision of children. The factors which affect a child's functional vision is that the ability to use eyesight in everyday situations include his or her motivation for learning, access to an environment which encourages use of functional vision, access to materials and technology which aid functional vision, training in the use of functional vision. Clearly, a child's medical condition is important and the term will provide useful information to the career. For example, the implications of albinism are likely to include ensuring the child is protected from bright lighting. But the term albinism does not mean that every child with albinism will require exactly the same measure of protection. Each child's needs must be accessed individually. If you are a fully sighted person, you will know that even your ability to see can be affected by the environmental factors or personal circumstances. So, if you are very tired, perhaps ill, you will find it hard to read, to take in information and process it. Similarly, if the print of a book is too small or you are reading in poor lighting conditions, you will find it harder both to discriminate the letters and concentrate, and so your speed of reading will decrease. Furthermore, if you are struggling to see, then your motivation to concentrate and learn will also be adversely affected. For example, you are in a large meeting, unable to see the facial features of the speaker clearly, then it is often harder to maintain an interest in what is being said. As your visual attention decreases, so often does your motivation to listen. Visually impaired children face these situations all the time, and yet they are not an inevitable consequence of visual impairment. Children can be trained to use their functional vision to maximum effect. Their motivation can be encouraged by following simple, often common sense principles when providing them with educational materials, planning their environment, and allowing them the freedom to explore, experience, and memorize this environment. Thus, the adults involved with a visually impaired child should be knowledgeable about both the visual impairment of the child and the other factors which affect his functional vision. Motivation for learning. The motivation to use the vision that is present is, in the final analysis, the responsibility of the child, but the importance of early intervention in a visually impaired child's development cannot be overemphasized. A visually impaired baby or a young child might not have the stimulus of sight to encourage him or her to develop all or any of the following normal steps that typically characterize development. Focus on faces, objects, follow movements, realize an object is there and so reach out to grasp it, see different facial expressions and gradually attach meaning to them, see lips move and realize language is emerging, realize that even if an object cannot be touched, it still exists and is still there. Copy movements. The importance of sensory stimulation at a young age for the development of the brain is well known. As the visually impaired child gets little incidental motivation to use its vision, it is understandable that there may be a tendency for that child to withdraw into passivity or self-simulation within its own body. For example, eye poking and hand flapping. Fully sighted babies or young children not only have a constant input of information through sight, their early communication with others generally visual and stimulates further development. A visually impaired child will often miss the visual clues of an adult's face. For example, the delighted smile at something the child has done. Instead of responding by repetition of that action and further developing it, the child may appear passive and unresponsive. This can in turn discourage the adult from further interaction with the child. It need not be so. However, if the adult is aware of this and instead uses touch or noise to communicate feelings of delight and pleasure. If the adult is also aware of the developmental needs of a sighted child, for example, what stimulates the child to explore and learn, then it is possible to think about how to adapt those principles for a visually impaired child by bringing objects and faces nearer, making objects brighter, providing greater contrast or better lighting, attaching noises to objects, reducing visual crowding, for example, by presenting objects one at a time against a suitable background. We are not talking of expensive specialized resources, but of adapting what already exists for fully sighted children. One excellent source of ideas and explanation for simulating vision is Show Me What My Friends Can See by Songsen and Stiff. As the visually impaired child gets older, the child will need to have objects in the environment explained and pointed out. It will depend on each individual's intellectual ability as well as the nature of their visual impairment as to how often explanations need to be repeated, perhaps once, perhaps several times. Thus, a child with poor distance vision may be told one day that the large red vehicle approaching is a bus. Note that the child will not necessarily know this and will need it pointed out at least once. And also will have to be explored a bus to know what it is. The color, sound and shape of the object will need to be memorized and retrieved by the child to identify a bus at a later stage. Such learning will depend on the child's ability to retain such information and use it at an appropriate time. However, early intervention to encourage such active looking is vital. Later on, the child's sense of direction will be affected as it will not see obstacles clearly and be able to plan routes. The child's concept of the surrounding world is also affected by visual impairment. The child cannot subconsciously take in visual information and begin to build up an ordered categorization of objects. For example, it will take longer for a visually impaired child to identify the common elements of a chair. That is, it has 4 legs and is for sitting in. And then to realize that a chair can be tall, small, made of wood or plastic and yet still remains a chair. This will probably never need to be explained to a fully sighted child. The visually impaired child needs to explore objects by touch, trying to than the sighted child's glance and recognition of an object. It is important that the career makes no assumptions about a visually impaired child's previous experiences and level of understanding about any subject, but finds out first what has been understood before moving on to the next stage and provides enough time for the child to explore and memorize his environment. As the child realizes it can make sense of what is around, it will be motivated to explore and learn more. Creating an optimum environment. The school or home environment is not usually within the direct control of the visually impaired child, but it may well be possible for the career to adapt to it to provide the best conditions for him. Now, this will involve thinking through the following issues: safety, clarity and contrast, lighting, ease of access for mobility and independence, the sound environment, providing good acoustic conditions. The first one, safety. Every child, whether sighted or not, will learn best in a safe and secure environment. The school or home environment is not always ideal, as it often has not been designed with the visually impaired child in mind. Nevertheless, adaptations can be made and common sense applied to improve it. Make sure that there are clear pathways and routes between areas. Clear pathways will include ensuring there are no projections such as shelves at eye and head level. Be organized in storing materials and resources so that a visually impaired child can find them without having to search in unknown places. An orderly and reasonably predictable environment will greatly enhance a child's confidence and enjoyment in the learning situation. Be aware of such hazards as trailing leads or ill-fitting carpets which might cause the child to trip. Encourage the child to explore his environment and get to learn routes between various places. If a visually impaired child is coming to a new school, it is a good idea if he can visit beforehand during the holidays with a mobility officer and become familiar with the school layout and learn important routes. Second, clarity and contrast. Clarity and contrast are important in relation to printed material. They are as important in the environment. Strong color contrast can greatly aid orientation. Doorways can be outlined in a contrasting color to the rest of the room, as can light switches, power points, etc., which are normally colored to blend in with the room. Contrasting paint along the edges of stairs is an effective means of aiding mobility and making the environment safer. White or yellow color is commonly used. The type of paint used within the room is also important, as different colors reflect different amounts of light. For example, a glossy white will reflect about 80% of the light falling on it, whereas a matte black surface reflects almost no light. As too much light or glare can add to a child's discomfort, this is a factor which should be borne in mind, especially when redecoration is an option. Many classes and schools have labels and notices throughout, providing necessary information for sighted and visually impaired children alike. It need not be a problem to ensure such notices are clearly printed and placed at eye level. As the Royal Institute of Architects recommend, as with many of these measures, they will help the sighted child as much as the visually impaired child. Third, lighting. Each individual will have different lighting needs, and while it may not be possible to change the environmental light, but it is possible to suit task lighting to an individual's needs. Be aware of the fact that bright lighting is not necessarily the best for a visually impaired child. This will depend on his visual condition also. The CIBS stands for Chartered Institute for Building Services. Recommendation for the proper level of illumination for near task is 300 lux for young, fully sighted people. For over 60s, 450 to 600 lux is thought necessary, and for visually impaired people, something over 1000 lux is probably needed. However, as each visually impaired individual will vary, each person's preference should be assessed. It can be helpful to have a light meter to measure light levels in the different areas a visually impaired child may be using or passing through at school and at home. Positioning of task lighting is very important. It can be difficult to find the best position. If placed to the side, the light source can cause unpleasant glare in the peripheral field vision, or the head may block the light and form shadows. However, if the lighting is placed over the text, which is often best, then heat coming from the light can cause problems too. One solution is to use a fluorescent tube. It is cheap, provides diffused light and stays cool also. Ease of access for mobility and independence. Orderly and predictable layouts of classrooms and school enable a visually impaired child to learn routes that remain constant. This builds up confidence and speed in moving about the learning environment. It also means a visually impaired child will be increasingly able to fetch necessary materials and resources independently. The effect of independent mobility on a child's self-esteem can be considerable, and this in turn can benefit learning. Fifth, sound environment. Ensuring good acoustic conditions. A visually impaired child is much more reliant on other senses for input of information than the sighted children, and hearing is the most important of these. It is vital then that the child is not distracted from listening to another person or from his own work by unnecessary background noises. The walls and floors, if covered with sound absorbing acoustic tiles or carpets, will muffle background noise and allow meaningful noise to be more audible. If this is not possible, then try to eliminate as much background noise as possible. For example, from radios. Create quiet areas for private work through the use of movable screens. If possible, allow children using technology such as a Perkins Braille, a designated place to work, where they feel comfortable, they are not disturbing others, and they also are not disturbed in their own work. Considerations for low vision students in a classroom. For educational purposes, the low vision student is typically one who reads print and has a corrected visual acuity of 20 or 70 or worse in the better eye. Most low vision students have very poor distance vision, so this makes it difficult for them to see the chalkboard or to gather detailed information from film strips, charts, or overhead screens. These students can usually read print and gain information from pictures, charts, and graphs when the material is up close. Each low vision student's needs are unique, but the following suggestions may be helpful when working with a low vision student in the classroom. Some of the general facts regarding students with low vision are: using the eyes does not injure or harm them. Encourage the student to use his or her eyes, since greater efficiency can only be developed through the use of the eyes for visual tasks unless a doctor has indicated otherwise. The use of glasses cannot help improve visual acuity for all eye conditions. Glasses may be worn to reduce glare and help with fatigue. Some students can read ordinary type with ease. Others may require large print, a handheld magnifier, or a closed circuit TV. The visually impaired child should be able to participate in most recreational activities except for those that require good visual acuity. That is, for example, dodgeball. Eyes cannot be strained but may tire quickly. An activity that allows the student to change focus is often helpful and appreciated. Holding materials close to the eyes will not harm them. Allow the student to position materials at a distance he or she chooses. Check the student's folder for the modification sheet. This will tell the classroom teacher what specific modifications need to be made in the classroom. Remember, these modifications are required since they are written in the student's individualized education plan (IEP). Contact the teacher of the visually impaired if you have questions or need suggestions for your particular room. Suggestions for the classroom teacher. Preferential seating is often necessary for a student with low vision. Let the student select a seat where he or she sees the best. Seat a student as close to the board as practical. Reduce glare from windows and lights as much as possible. Seat the student with his or her back to the windows. Read the student's functional vision evaluation to find out if this student can copy materials written on the board or overhead projector. Purple dittos or fuzzy Xerox copies should not be used with such kind of student. Clear contrast between the print and the background will help the student be more successful. Black print on white paper is usually the best. If other modifications are required, they should be contained in the list of modifications handed out at the beginning of the semester and in his or her functional vision evaluation of the special education folder. Contrast, print style, and spacing of letters can be more important than the print. Low vision students may require more time to complete the assignments. Low vision students are usually slow readers because of the visual impairment. Standardized tests that require separate answer sheets may be especially difficult for a student to use. Check the modifications to see what procedure to use. Word games, puzzles, and graphs may be inappropriate for a low vision student. Check with the sixth teacher if you are unsure. Give the student the grade he or she earns. Donating a grade to a student really hinders but does not help the students learn. Storing and using large print materials may be difficult for the student to manage in a classroom. Help the student find a place for books and supplies. Also, a locker may not be accessible if it has a combination lock. Understanding a low vision student. The emotional needs of a low vision student are like those of any other. He or she wants to be liked by the teachers and by the peers. They do not want to be different. Schedule a time for a private meeting with a child. This will allow the student to tell you about seating preferences, lighting, and modifications that are helpful. Have the student explain his or her visual problem to you. Try not to call attention to the child's eye problem in front of the class. Always use the student's name when addressing him or her. The rules of discipline should be the same for a low vision student as for any other unless the IEP states otherwise. So much of communication is non-verbal. Often, a student with low vision is unable to recognize the expression on someone's face or figure out what has happened in a situation that is non-verbal. It is helpful if the teacher privately explains the situation to the student with low vision. Be aware of the student's frustration level since so much of learning and school is visual. It is easy for a student with poor acuity to become frustrated. If you notice the student has food or ink on his face or clothes, discreetly tell them. To conclude with, in order for visually impaired children to begin to use their vision most efficiently, they must be encouraged to look properly, to be trained in scanning and search procedures. They should find such training interesting and rewarding, for they might well be too accustomed to not seeing and therefore feel no incentive to look for visual information. Training in these skills should be part of an overall program of learning to use functional vision, which includes all the points, rather than be a tick list of skills to be covered. Training visually impaired children to use their functional vision should be tailored to their individual needs and involve a lot of creative common sense. Observe the child and identify strengths and weakness. Then work out what can be done to overcome any problem that exists. Above all, remember that the child will be in school with all its support systems for only a few years, and the ultimate objective of any training program should be to enable the visually impaired child to cope as well as possible in a world that still makes few allowances for visual impairment. Newspapers will not necessarily be enlarged for her. Obstacles on the pavement may not be removed, and a good training program will have provided the young person with the strategies and confidence to deal with such challenges. Continuing visual assessment on a day-to-day basis is essential. Normally, the first assessment of a visually impaired child will have been carried out by the doctors who diagnosed the visual impairment. It will have included the assessment of near and distance vision, but significantly, the test will have been carried out in clinical conditions. It is important, therefore, that visually impaired children are assessed by teachers of the visually impaired for near and distance vision as described, and that any information gathered is conveyed to others also. As stressed before, the visual acuity and print should be one that the child finds comfortable in normal surroundings rather than the absolute best that can be seen, which is hard to sustain during a whole lesson. However, once an initial assessment has been carried out, it is important that there are regular formal and informal assessment throughout the child's education by teachers of visually impaired children. How often the formal assessment is carried out will depend on the resources of the staff. Once a term is probably a good target.